So my talk this afternoon is going to be about the psychological analysis of the pathway to violence in mass shooters, specifically focusing today on the cases of Anders Breivik and Adam Lanza. There are inherent challenges to identifying individuals who are at high risk of engaging in extreme violence, such as mass shooting. One of the main challenges to identifying these individuals is that the behaviour that we're trying to predict is extremely rare. Because the event rate is so low, conventional research techniques or methods are completely useless here. Many academics have explored and investigated the myths and misconceptions surrounding serial homicide behaviour. For instance, it's an erroneous assumption to make that a person who is intending on engaging in mass violence will avoid publicising their intentions online prior to their attack. Many mass shooters will actually actively post things in the forms of pictures, videos and text online prior to their attacks. For instance, the case of Elliot Rodgers, who posted up his Day of Retribution video prior to killing 6 people and injuring 14 others near the campus of the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2014. Also prior to his attack, Elliot Rodgers sent through an email his friends, family, therapists and teachers a 107,000-word manifesto that he'd self-entitled My Twisted World. We must further our understanding of the psychological traits and triggers that lead to these really extreme violent behaviours if we are to identify and prevent it. Psychiatrist Michael Fitzgerald argued that school shootings and mass shootings are not uncommonly carried out by people with neurodevelopmental disorders, such as Asperger's syndrome, with often a very good deal of warning online in the form of pictures and text. Michael Fitzgerald argued and posited that a new diagnosis be created that he called criminal autistic psychopathy, which is a subcategory of people with Asperger's syndrome. He felt that this diagnosis would help differentiate this small subgroup of individuals with autism who engage in these extremely violent behaviours, thus separate them from the general population of individuals with autism who are no more likely to engage in violent behaviour than the general population. And in fact, some would even suggest they're actually even less likely to commit violent behaviours than the general population. There's also been other researchers that have posited the link between autism spectrum disorders, which I'll now refer to as autism for the remainder of the presentation, and serial homicide behaviour. Given these really interesting findings, this really led myself to investigate this in more detail, looking at the rate of psychosocial stressors and neurodevelopmental disorders in mass shooters and serial killers. For an unbiased sample of 75 mass shooters, we found that 8% of this group had a diagnosis of autism, or their family or friends strongly advocated that they definitely had this diagnosis. Although this is 8 times the rate of that found in the general population, the findings do not suggest that individuals with autism are more likely to be a mass shooter. In fact, there's many things that exacerbate issues in people with autism. For instance, they might have issues in their lives and problems in their lives that is actually exacerbated, and they actually find it much more difficult to cope. Common comorbidities are also existent in people with autism. For instance, mood disorders such as anxiety and depression are very common, and behaviour disorders such as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD. These findings of an increased prevalence of autism within this extremely violent group of mass shooters was consistent with an earlier study where we also found the same higher prevalence in mass shooters and serial killers. However, it's very important to point out here that every single one of those individuals with autism that engaged in this extreme violent behaviour all had experienced psychosocial stressors such as victimisation in school, bullying, parental neglect or abuse, etc. So what can we really say then about the rate of offending in general in this particular group of individuals? What does the research tell us? I think one of the kind of key landmark studies within this area is a study that was published by Hitler and colleagues in 2010. They looked at the rate and nature of crimes in 177 individuals with Asperger's syndrome, and they found that the rate of crimes was no different to that of the general population. In case records spanning 22 years, they found that there were 33 convictions. Of those 33 convictions, there were 3 cases of bodily injury, 1 case of robbery, and 1 case of violent and threatening behaviour. And the researchers argued that this was no different to the general population. Individuals with autism are no more likely to be violent compared to the general population. However, in saying that, there is a small subgroup of individuals with autism who, when they do engage in violent crime, it tends to be very extreme. On the 14th of December 2012, 20-year-old Adam Lanza killed 26 people, 20 of which were young children, in the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Adam Lanza was quite a couple of times throughout his childhood and adolescence diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome and obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. A report detailing the warning signs and red flags exhibited by Lanza prior to his attack was published a couple of years after his attack in 2012. The report argued that in Lanza's case, his severe and worsening internalised mental health disorders, combined with an atypical preoccupation with mass violence and access to weapons, were the key factors which contributed to his violent episodes in that 2012. The report also revealed that in 5th grade, Adam Lanza produced an extremely disturbing project which he'd called the Big Book of Granny. The content of this book was considered obsessive, both in length and tone. It featured intense violence, containing images and narratives depicting child murder, cannibalism, and taxidermy. The people that created the report said that most children wouldn't even know how to invent the material within this report that he'd created. The mental health professionals that contributed to the report also said that had the report been subject to really careful review by school staff, it would have really highlighted the need for Adam Lanza to seek child psychiatric evaluations. However, the report does also argue that teachers may not have the necessary training or expertise that will help them identify individuals who are at risk or who are demonstrating red flags, or understand when to seek further assessments, particularly for individuals who are progressing well academically, but who are struggling socially and having social deficits. Another report revealed that Adam Lanza had also compiled a spreadsheet on mass shooters that occurred over the years. Specifically, it was a 4 by 7 foot spreadsheet with detail on over 500 mass shooters, outlining all manner of details, including the weapons used, the body counts, and the location of the attack. Such was the level of detail of the report, it was considered to have taken absolutely years to compile, and was considered to be used as a score sheet by Adam Lanza as well. One anonymous law enforcement veteran stated in a quote, "It was like a doctoral thesis. That was the quality of the research." There was also other warning signs that Adam Lanza exhibited, and I think one of the kind of key things here was his use of garbage bags in order to block out natural daylight in his bedroom and computer room. You can see here from the picture, this is a picture from his bedroom. However, there was no one single factor which triggered Adam Lanza's attack. Instead, there was a number of contributory factors that resulted in his planned and well-executed attack. For instance, his increase in isolation, his loss of school, his increase in isolation even from his own family, living in the same roof, his symptoms of OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety and depression also worsened during this time, and it was also considered that his profound and potentially worsening anorexia nervosa was also an issue here and factor. Adam Lanza's obsession with mass shooters also increased and he became very preoccupied during this time, and a forensic review did reveal that his preoccupations with mass shooters had increased dramatically and was extremely intense. Indeed, Adam Lanza was really fascinated with Norwegian mass shooter Anders Breivik and was found to have researched him extensively. Adam Lanza also used many of the techniques employed by Anders Breivik as well and replicated them. For instance, the use of first-person shooter games for training purposes and how to as marksman trainingship. Adam Lanza, in the last couple of months prior to his attack, also became really actively engaged in a small online community of people who shared his dark obsession with mass shooters. The FBI Behavioural Analysis Unit also found and determined that after extensive forensic review of Adam Lanza's computer usage, that his level of attention, his attention to detail and his obsessive nature with mass shooters was quite literally, quote, unprecedented. On the 22nd of July 2011, Anders Breivik, Norwegian mass shooter, bombed government buildings in Oslo and then proceeded to the island of Utøya, where he killed 77 individuals. For this, he was sentenced to prison for 21 years. But the question is asked, what is it that motivated Anders Breivik here? Why did he kill in this manner? It's not as simple to say that he was a terrorist, supporting an idealised religion, or simply dismissing this man as being insane. He himself has claimed that his actions were motivated to save Europe from radical Islam, and that his actions and his motivations were all for the goodness, not evil. However, after studying detailed assessments of this far-right terrorist, and assessing as well Anders Breivik's own writing in his self-published manifesto, we have found that a condition known as narcissistic decompensation may have been behind his beliefs that he was waging a personal and political war. Up until the age of 27 years, Anders Breivik had experienced a number of social stressors and life stressors. For instance, he had a really difficult relationship with his mother. He'd experienced rejection from political elites and gaming elites as well. In sum, his life experiences up until that point had culminated in numerous failed attempts to gain positions of power and status, attention and adoration from others. A narcissistic decompensation can occur when someone with a narcissistic personality disorder experiences significant crises and major injuries to their self-esteem. It occurs when there's a significant discrepancy between that individual's grandiose fantasies and their average or mediocre accomplishments. Since the person does not get the validation from reality, for instance, attention, adoration, and love that they so desperately desire, they experience a decompensation. Narcissistic decompensation can consist of a depression marked by psychomotor retardation, disruptive sleep patterns, becoming perseverative in one's speech or writings, pursuing an addiction, or expressing an extreme sense of outrage. As a result, the person isolates themselves due to the harsh reality that they're not of grand power and status, and will turn to themselves to feed their own grandiosity by supplying their own sense of attention and adoration. In Breivik's case, his narcissistic decompensation, we argued, began around the age of 27 years, lasting approximately 2 to 3 years. He rewrites his life history to try and bring this sense of grandeur. He rewrites himself as being a high-ranking Freemason. It's also around about this time where he becomes really fixated on the idea that there's a conspiracy amongst Islamic immigrants to take over Europe, something he himself called the Islamization of Europe. One of Oslo's most prominent psychiatrists argued and told the court of law during the case that Anders Breivik was probably suffering from Asperger's syndrome, Tourette's syndrome, and narcissistic personality disorder. He'd also argued that it could not be completely ruled out that Anders Breivik was suffering from possible paranoid psychosis. The support that this psychiatrist gave for, in particular, Anders Breivik's Asperger's syndrome was his difficulties with social signals, the lack of emotion and feeling that he portrayed when discussing his victims during the courts. He also was very monotonous in tone of voice. He was obsessed with writing, something known as hypergraphia, and was obsessed by numbers and had a really, really strong memory ability. Also, I think it's quite interesting here, around about the age of 4, Anders Breivik actually had a psychiatric evaluation, and the psychiatrist at this time also kind of agreed that Anders Breivik was possibly suffering from Asperger's syndrome. So these two conditions, narcissistic personality disorder and Asperger's or autism, together may form a particularly dangerous combination. It might actually increase the risk of someone engaging in these extremely violent behaviours, such as mass shooting. Similar to previous studies, we have found that there could be a link between having narcissistic personality disorder and engaging in this really extreme violent behaviour. However, in Anders Breivik's case, we think that narcissistic decompensation may have occurred at the time when he was relying on an Asperger's coping strategy, so engaging and become really fixated on a certain thing, could have been the final thing that pushed him onto the path towards intended violence. Narcissism has been found to be a risk factor in mass shooters and school shooters. I think one of the key studies in this area is one that looked at 7 German school shootings. In these 7 offenders, 2 were found to display high levels of narcissistic personality traits. When these 2 individuals were investigated further, one was actually considered to be fulfill the requirements for a full diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. Interestingly, the rate of narcissistic personality disorder in the general population is just under 1%. However, this prevalence is much higher in clinical samples and can be anything between 2% and as much as 16%. The fact that the study found that 1 in 7 of these school shooters had this diagnosis really showed that the prevalence was actually much closer to that found in clinical samples rather than the general population. So therefore, narcissism may be one of the risk factors in precipitating these extremely violent attacks. However, caution must be put in place here. Narcissistic traits are not a necessary condition for motivating a mass shooting. Similarly, having an autism spectrum disorder and narcissistic personality disorder combined will not necessarily by themselves propel the individual on the path to violence. It's really key to point out here that other factors are important and are at play here in these individuals. Although little is known about the warning signs or early warning signs and red flags in these individuals, the route itself has been well defined in the aftermath. Essentially, as you can see here, the pathway towards intended violence starts with harboured grievances that are developed and continue with the idea, for instance in the case of Anders Breivik, that he was saving Europe from radical Islam. The next stage, stage 2, as you can see in the pathway here, is ideation. At this stage, the potential would-be mass shooter starts to view violence as being the only option available to them. It's at this stage as well where they'll start to identify with other assailants and other mass shooters that have occurred, and they'll also start expressing their thoughts to others at this stage as well, and very obsessively as well. This is then followed by research and planning and preparation, followed by breach of security. In the case of Anders Breivik, he used GPS to scout routes around Utøya Island prior to the attack. And then finally, this all culminates in the actual final attack itself, stage 6 of the pathway to violence model. Although autism-based deficits interacted with psychopathology in their clinical presentation, what was common and critical for mass violence to occur was that these factors coexisted or combined with the pathway to violence, in this case the stages 1 of grievances. Basically, anyone who starts with grievances and crystallises these in ideation and then follows the subsequent steps of preparation, research and planning and breach of security will highly likely engage in an extreme violent attack of mass shooting. However, in Breivik's case, we argue that it wasn't his narcissistic personality disorder per se that led him down the pathway to violence. Rather, it was his narcissistic decompensation and its overlap with the first stage in the pathway to violence, grievances, that really motivated his attack. The pathway to violence and the factors that drive someone to become a mass shooter requires urgent, detailed investigation. Mass shooting episodes are rarely impulsive and are typically well planned and executed over months and even years. The pathway to violence, therefore, really opens up to us a great opportunity for the development of threat assessment. In this, months or weeks or years even, the potential would-be mass shooter behaviours, fantasies and actions escalate, provides us an opportunity with which to identify these individuals and put in place preventative strategies in order to try and avoid these atrocities from occurring. In the aftermath of a mass shooting, the question is always asked, could it have been prevented? Psychological analysis is just one way we can recognise and begin to start understanding further the red flags and warning signs in these individuals and prevent these atrocities before they even occur. Thank you. you.